Thank you and welcome to this panel discussion. I hope you're enjoying your summit as much as I am. Today, I do have a fantastic group of people that I have really been looking forward to get in discussion about real-time payment systems across the world. And looking forward to hearing about their experiences, their lessons learned, some of their successes. And I think it's a timely discussion for us in Canada as we're in the midst of implementing our own real-time payment system. Now, again, we don't have a lot of time, but we do have a lot to cover. So I'll jump straight into it. And thank you for joining us here today, for all of you who traveled so far to be here. Andy, the furthest. So could you each maybe start with a little bit of context and briefly tell me about the real-time payment system that you offer in your market and a little bit about how it operates and how it's structured, but maybe taking it a step further in terms of what is the market uptake been and some of the use cases that you're seeing emerge and anything that's maybe surprised you since you launched. I'll start in the US with you, Margaret, at the Clearinghouse.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me here. The Clearinghouse has been in the real-time payment space for just over 6 years and have built up about 70% coverage of the bank accounts in the United States and are getting really good uptake around some key use cases. Me-to-me, account-to-account transfers are one of the biggest use cases. We're having earned wage access, real-time payments. We're getting a lot of disbursements from businesses to consumers in the insurance industry, as well as loan disbursements. One of our really fun ones is car loan disbursements over the weekend is meeting a big need. And then, of course, we have a P2P payments solution called Zelle in the US that a lot of the back-end settlement is going through the real-time payments network, as well as merchant card acquiring payments are taking place through our network.
Oh, interesting. Thanks, Margaret. What about at the Fed?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me back. A lot changes in a year. When I was here a year ago, we were just ramping up, getting ready to launch FedNow, and we're in the middle of testing with the pilot group. Happy to say that we successfully launched in July with 35 participants and 16 service providers. It was definitely stressful, but at the same time, it was historic. This was the first new payment system that the Federal Reserve has launched in over 50 years. It was about time. But everything went very, very smoothly. In terms of where we are today, as of this morning, we currently have 800 participants, wow. 800 banks on the network, and over 30 service providers. So adoption has been extremely strong. We also have a lot to go, though, because obviously we have over 9,000 banks and credit unions in the US, and our goal is to make sure that they all have the access to FedNow and to instant payments. In terms of use cases, I think we're seeing very similar type of use cases, me-to-me, account-to-account, funding, defunding of wallets, defunding of brokerage accounts, insurance payments, early wage access, which it's also starting to pick up speed. I would like to see more progress in terms of bill pay, but we're starting to see that getting more and more attention, and government payments, both local as well as federal, but I think that's an area we're going to see a lot of growth looking ahead.
Yeah, very interesting, because I think your market is probably going to be very similar to ours in terms of what are those use cases that emerge. Andy, in Australia, what can you tell us about your system?
Well, likewise, firstly, thanks for having me. Very similar to the Clearinghouse, actually, and I should say, by the way, that we don't operate the payment system, the real-time payment system, but we had a role in creating it, and it went live in 2018, so six years, similar to Margaret. It's now, if you look at last year's volumes, it's up at about 1.4 billion transactions and 1.6 trillion in value. So that's about 30% of our account-to-account payment volume and about 9% of the value. So biased towards lower value transactions, although the single biggest transaction through the real-time payment rails was $38 billion, which was a government payment. So it's not limited. It's just what it tends to get used for. Just as a bit of background, when it went live, it was fully ISO 20022 enabled, genuinely real time, so those payments are within 10 seconds. It was built around some smart addressing. So as a consumer, you can register your mobile or your email, and as a corporate, you can register your Australian business number, and that uniquely identifies you, so no more sort of bank sort codes, branch codes, and account numbers. So that was a really good implementation, and it's genuinely 24/7, 365. Use cases, it's done really well in Pay Anyone, so direct credits. It's got about 40% of the volume there, and I should say the residual volume is in our ACH. And then future use cases that are coming. So there's a mandated payment service, so that will really be direct debits as you'd think of them, that is being rolled out now. And then very shortly, an international payment service, so the last leg of cross-border payments becoming real-time as well.
Interesting. Thanks, Andy. And as I mentioned earlier, we're in the midst of implementing our real-time payment system. So what are some of the lessons that you maybe have that you could share with us from your experience and your implementation, perhaps both in the build stage and the go-live stage and maybe even after go-live? Margaret? Clearinghouse?
So in terms of our build, it was long enough ago that I wasn't actually at the clearinghouse, but like Australia, we're built on an ISO 20022 infrastructure. And the thing that we've done recently in the ISO realm is on our high value payments network. And one of the things I would say is probably most relevant is in the testing environment for that movement. It was really important to test early and often, do a lot of tabletop exercises, and also we had this notion of a buddy bank, so that when people started testing, they actually were testing real transactions with real trading partners, and that was one of the things that I think recently led to the great success of that initiative. A lot of those learnings were built on the RTP implementation we had done 6 years earlier.
Right, okay. And Andy?
Yeah, so I think there are some real questions around what day one looks like when you're building a real-time payment rail. So I think the first one is a technology question, and obviously, 6 years ago, technology looked very different. So Canada has some pretty good opportunities there, I think, to think about the kind of technology it uses, and a core one there is effectively is that technology distributed to financial institutions. We've now got about 100 financial institutions that connect to NPP, or is it a centralised pipe? And there are advantages and disadvantages with each in terms of enhancements, further use cases that you add, fraud monitoring that we might come on to. But I think that's a key question. Linked to that is the question around what's your day one go live like? What use cases you're actually furnishing? And I think that's pretty key because Australia's seen pretty good growth in real-time payment usage. The numbers that I talked to earlier, that's faster growth over those 6 years than, say, Singapore or the UK or Denmark or Sweden, and about comparable with Hong Kong. So that's pretty good, but what's your value proposition on day one? And unfortunately, we've all done enough projects where you tend to go to MVP on day one. That may not actually supercharge that growth. And then the third key question, which is a bit of a controversial one, my comment would be that most countries are really good at setting up new payment rails. They don't think it's all about closing down old ones. Per an earlier panel, we are getting rid of checks, but we're also starting a conversation about should we get rid of ACH? Because if you've built a real-time payment rail that is there to add productivity and growth to the economy and benefits to end users, whether they're consumers or businesses, then you should be using it. You shouldn't be using legacy technology that isn't 24/7, 365, real-time, etc.
I know Margaret's got a comment that she always says that in America.
Yeah, I think there are markets where that is possible, I would say, in the US, and probably in Canada. primacy of both consumer and business choice means we don't shut down things that people still want to use. People typically migrate when there's a better value proposition. And I was talking to Robyn earlier and a couple other folks here. You know, I may not really understand why good people still use checks, but there are enough good people still using checks. And as a writer of checks myself, the trigger for why I'm writing checks is less important often than what value I'm getting from the provider who wants the check. So the example I use is my mother is in memory care. I have 2 women who come to visit her, and they want to be paid by check. And my mother is worth more to me than the hassle of writing a check. And so I'm not going to test that. And in the US, we don't test those kind of relationships. What happens is if there's enough negatives, you know, if the distillation of fraud in the check rail becomes problematic, that banks stop offering it to consumers or start charging more for it, then some of the incentives change. So I think, you know, in Canada, your regulators aren't quite likely to take on the political activity, I think, that would involve shutting down rails. Yeah. But it could happen.
If I can just quickly respond, I get all of that. I think the question for those individuals who prefer to be paid by check is, once the real-time payment rail is there, wouldn't they rather have the money usable immediately? And so that's a question for them. Well, and they may or may not know the benefit of that. But I mean, you know, we're building this infrastructure for a reason, which is to get money in people's or corporates' hands quicker. Yeah. And that has an economic benefit. So that's what we should be driving to. But I mean, I get that it's an easier question when checks are 0.2% of your payments than when they're a lot higher, right?
Yeah. Okay. So Nick, I know that you obviously, as you mentioned, implemented last year. So I think, you know, a more recent experience in terms of what you can maybe share with us in your implementation.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, let me just say to end this point, his point on technology really resonated to me. So especially looking ahead, when it comes to technology, build for the future, don't build for the now. And that's something that we did with FedNow as well, in terms of it's what drove us to the reason to actually ended up building ourselves and also to build it in the cloud. Mm-hmm. But in terms of some recent lessons learned that might apply to you as well, industry engagement is key. So we spent a lot of time engaging with the industry before we built FedNow. While we're building FedNow, we stood up the pilot group, we stood up a FedNow community, and that's something that is going to continue allow us to have real-time access to our future participants. And in fact, we created this early testing group where we expose our pre-alpha code, I would say, of FedNow to a number of participants, so they can actually start testing and give us some real-time feedback, and we made adjustments. So industry engagement is key. The second one, I would say, is meet customers where they're at. So build a lot of flexibility within the program and also within the product. So we did a lot in terms of industry readiness and trying to move the industry along, getting ready for instant payments. But the reality is that every bank, every credit union, they're in different places on their journey. So we had to account for that within our program, and we also had to account for that within the product by building a lot of flexibility in terms of different ways to connect, different profiles, and things like that. The third I would offer is onboarding is key. And having a smooth onboarding experience for customers is their, entry door to the service, is their first impression. We built up a digital platform for onboarding. We digitized our whole process for onboarding, and also we stood up a team that was focused on just onboarding customers and making that very, very smooth. Our record to date is 8 days between an institution signing their operating circular, the rules, so the contract, to actually going live. Wow. So that's our record. Not everything went smoothly, so maybe just a word of caution. Time to market was very important to us, so we parallelized a lot of work streams to the point that we actually started to slow down rather than go faster, and we had to do a little reset and make sure that we're focusing on the right things at the right time.
Yeah.
So just a little something to share there.
Thank you, appreciate it. And I think I liked Matt's comment earlier in terms of Canada coming from something to something. It's not like we're coming from nothing to something. So I think that's a nuance that we have to take into consideration. So I know we had a panel discussion about fraud, so we won't talk too long about this, but we can't have a real-time payments discussion without talking about fraud. So maybe just some quick thoughts or experiences maybe that you've had on the fraud space, and any advice you may have for Canada on this topic. Nick, I'll go to you first.
Well, yeah, so certainly there was a lot of conversation on fraud before, and I definitely, the whole concept that it's a team sport resonated with me. And I think the operators of the payment systems definitely have a role to play there in terms of building functionality features that can help participants manage their fraud risk. That's an area that we prioritize for our first release, but that's an area that we're gonna continue to release new features and functionality related for risk management. I think it's important, but I don't think it's sufficient. I think it does require a lot of collaboration at industry level to make sure that we manage this. We're in early stages of instant payments in the US, and you will be as well. So having that early focus on risk management and fraud is going to be very, very critical.
And I know, Andy, obviously you've been live for a little bit longer, and from a North American perspective, we know what our trends are, but what are you seeing in Australia?
Yeah, so just one comment on the team sport piece. I think we need to sort of see it as a bigger team as well. So I think it's not just a payments problem. We need to do our bit, and I'll come on to that as a payments industry, but we also need to be working with the social media platforms, the telcos, the ISPs, to make sure that they're doing their bit as well, and that's, there's a regulatory role to ensure that that happens. We're starting to do that on scams in Australia. In terms of real-time payments, I think it is back to that day one piece, and can you build confirmation of pay in? I think we're starting to work on that now, and I think in retrospect that probably should have been day one functionality, and it's probably easier in that centralised system than it is in a distributed one. Similarly with risk-based friction, and I think the danger if you don't get that right is you look at the UK, which is about to bring a rule in that says a sending institution can pause a payment for 4 days. It stops being a real-time payment. It goes, you're rewinding 3 decades at that point. So I think that's why you've got to build, COP, but also that risk-based friction for banks in from day one.
Margaret, have you seen much fraud on your system?
We haven't seen much fraud, and I think it really relates to kind of 3 key lines of defense that we've seen be critical. So there's a technology piece to preventing fraud, but actually the number one thing we've used to prevent fraud is a rules-based approach, looking at and leveraging data from the banks about high-risk use cases and taking a studied approach on what use cases we allow to be permissible, so that we're building gradually to higher risk use cases. I think the second thing is probably the most important thing, which is the first line of defense for fraud in a payment system are the banks on our networks. And if we take a technology-first approach that doesn't take into account how the processing actually happens at the bank, we're missing the opportunity to really allow the straight-through processing. So we could have, the greatest risk score ever centrally, but if the banks aren't in a position to decision on that, then we've done a lot of work and not gotten the benefit from it. So to me, really understanding the data elements and ISO messaging is a great way to really standardize that and use that not just for this payment rail, but to the point of the earlier panel, fraud moves across payment rails. So the more consistently we think about that data element and that straight-through processing approach, the more we can help the payment system overall protect from fraud.
Yeah, totally agree. Thanks. So we've only got a couple of minutes left, and I know we wanted to get to this question, so I'm glad we can. Tell me what's next for your real-time payment system. Andy, what's next for you in Australia?
Well, so I'm at risk with Margaret here, but I've done this with Jane Larimer for Natcha, so I'm confident. For us, it is this discussion about, do you continue to have an ACH system? And that's not, tomorrow.
Yeah.
So we've put a target date out that says we could potentially close down the ACH system in 2030. Now that, if you did my maths earlier, that involves a transition of about $15 trillion worth of payments from ACH to real time. I completely agree with Margaret that you've got to see the value for those payments in moving across and for those use cases. And but we've deliberately put that data out to start that discussion, and particularly with large corporate users, large government users. I think that is important. It's also important then about the capabilities of the modern payment systems in terms of their reach. We're about 90% of accounts in Australia, so there's a remaining 10%. There's questions about capacity when you get to those volumes, resilience, ISO 20022 harmonisation becomes important because you've got the cross-border piece in there as well. Yeah. And crucially, we think the risk to that timeline and the discussion that we want to have is around bulk payments. So things like payroll, large government payments, where the value isn't necessarily the real-time element. The value is the 24/7/365, or it's the data. But let's start having that discussion, because if you don't, the danger is banks are continuing to invest and where the cost of legacy infrastructure, you're not really adding to the productivity and growth of the economy. So I think it's about having that discussion and moving towards that now.
Very interesting. I know a lot of the rest of the world is looking at you about that discussion.
Yeah, I think it's us and Indonesia who have started putting those thoughts out there, but I don't think we'll be alone for too long.
Margaret, what's next at the Clearinghouse?
So we're definitely continuing to invest a lot on the fraud and risk management front. We're also continuing to look at global opportunities. Many folks saw that we did a pilot with the Eurozone. We've proven technically that isn't a challenge. It's really the economics and kind of the corridors and the timing of that. But I think there'll be, a watch this space around international over the next 18 months. And then I think the really big blocking and tackling activity that we're taking a very hard look at is the request for payment space. And the biggest challenge in the US is really, when you've got fraudsters spoofing billers, the user experience around a request for payment when you've got, 9,000 banks and, hundreds of thousands of legitimate billers is a non-trivial activity. So we're taking a staged approach to how we roll this out. We've proven the technical elements of it. We now need to work on the user experience and the adoption elements, but I think there'll be a lot of new information in that space in the coming year.
Very interesting point. I mean, just given the environment that we've found ourselves suddenly in these
Yeah, we don't want to supercharge, scams.
Okay, and lastly, Nick, FedNow.
Well, I would say request for payment. There's just so much promise around that feature when it comes to instant payments, and just so much opportunity there for innovation. But our job one is adoption, so making sure that we get to that nationwide reach for FedNow. We're looking in terms of supporting use cases and growth on the network in terms of volume. And then also new features and functionalities. I talked about a couple in terms of continuing to release fraud features that banks and participants can take advantage to manage their fraud risk. There are other things that we're looking at as well in terms of other technologies and features that are high on the participant list that we're looking to roll into the product. Something interesting about FedNow, I was talking to somebody earlier. I got the question in terms of, well, how often do you release new code into production? We do it every 2 weeks.
Oh, wow.
So we're continuously releasing code, and it's transparent to our customers.
Well, thank you. That's actually all we have time for, but I really appreciate you coming out to Canada and spending some time with us and sharing your insights. And I do hope you enjoy the rest of your summit. And thank you, everyone, for listening, and enjoy the rest of your summit.
Thanks for having us.